The Samsung NX10 was released back in 2010. Now, at the time, this cost around $700. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $200. So, just what do you get with this 12-year-old camera? Well, there's a 15.1 megapixel APS-C size sensor, contrast detect autofocus, and a 3-inch 614K LCD screen. Build quality of the NX10 is a combination of metal and plastic, and I gotta say, it's a really solid little camera. You know, it's funny because it's such a small camera and you would think it would be kind of awkward to hold, but ergonomically, it actually feels really good in your hands. And of course, you've got plenty of external buttons and dials, so you're not having to dive into the menu system all that often to make changes. Overall, it's a really good feeling camera. You know, Samsung is a weird company. In terms of photography, they were late to the party. They left really early, but in that short period of time that they were there, they actually did some really interesting things. For example, the Samsung NX10 is an interesting part of history. This was actually the very first mirrorless camera to have an APS-C size sensor. You know, up until this point, all mirrorless cameras were just micro four thirds. Now, in terms of shutter speed, you've got up to 1/4000th of a second. Would be nice to see 1/8000th of a second, and admittedly, I know I sound like a broken record on this, but that 1/4000th of a second limit is just pretty common on a lot of these older cameras. And in terms of burst rate, you've got 3 frames per second up to 10 frames in JPEG, and 3 frames per second up to 3 frames in RAW. The lens mount on the NX10 is the Samsung NX mount, and in terms of lenses, you are not hurting for options. Samsung actually made a ton of shockingly good lenses for this camera system. You know, for just me personally, I've got a handful of kit lenses. I've got the 16mm f2.4, I've got the 30mm f2.0, I've got the 45mm f1.8, and I've got the 16mm f2.8 macro. And of course, there's always that really brilliant 85mm f1.8. In terms of autofocus, the NX10 has a contrast detect based system, and it's okay, you know. It's okay for photography. It's not going to lock on to a person's eye the way modern autofocus would, but it's still totally usable. Instead, the NX10's autofocus just kind of shows its age more in video mode. It kind of hunts and meanders and just sort of, is that the subject? Is that it over there? I'm not really sure. Are you sure? You know, it's a contrast detect system from 12 years ago. In terms of photography, the NX10 has that classic Samsung color science, and I gotta say, that is hands down my favorite part of this camera. You see, Samsung always had a way of making images really saturated without being obnoxiously saturated the way, say, a modern day smartphone or action camera is. You know, it's not that kind of punch you in the face saturation. Instead, it's just a really well done, smooth, pleasing saturation. You know, it kind of makes me think of like in the 50s when people would see a good looking girl and say, she's easy on the eyes. Samsung color science really is like easy on the eyes. I mean, it's just pleasing to look at. Now, in terms of video, the NX10 does a mind-blowing 720p at 30 frames per second, and that is it. That's literally your only option. You know, I gotta say, it's not that bad looking for what it is, but it's just kind of a bummer by modern standards. I mean, I know people like to make that argument like, hey man, your whole audience is probably watching on a phone. 720p is perfectly fine. Yeah. 720p, even when I'm on a phone, that's the first thing I notice is, hey, that looks like that was shot in 720p. Not to mention, you know, there's not really any kind of image stabilization, so video footage is kind of shaky, and you don't have any higher frame rates, so there's no real slow motion B-roll. The footage just kind of is what it is. Basically, if you want to get the most out of this camera in terms of video, you kind of need to have the camera on a tripod, and realistically, you kind of even need to use manual focus. The autofocus is okay, it will find the subject, but like I mentioned earlier, it just kind of drifts around and it'll focus more on the background more than on a person's face, so that is something to take into consideration. Again though, we've got to remember this is a 12-year-old camera, and these types of cameras doing video was sort of new territory back then, so it was perfectly fine by 2010 standards, but by modern standards, it is kind of noticeably lacking. So of course, that begs the obvious question, is the Samsung NX10 still worth it in 2022? And this is kind of a difficult one. The camera itself is perfectly fine, and as someone who's owned this camera for 10 years, I like it. I genuinely enjoy using it, but the thing is, I'm a camera collector, and so when this camera's limitations get in the way, I literally have like 40-something other cameras that I can choose from, and so it's not that big of a deal. But if you're someone who's just looking for one camera or one extra camera, it's kind of hard to recommend that to someone in those circumstances. See, a big part of the problem with the NX10 is the price of the NX10. It's still selling for around $200, and that's just way too expensive for what it is. I mean, keep in mind that Canon 5D Classic that I reviewed a few months ago, I paid $176 for that. The NX10 is more expensive than the Canon 5D Classic, and that 5D Classic's a professional full-frame camera with some really good-looking image quality. The other problem is at $200, there's still a handful of other cameras that both do photo and video, and they do it pretty well, like the Sony NX5R. I paid $130 for that camera. That's a brilliant camera for both photography and videography. I mean, on a budget, obviously. The NX5R actually has phase detect autofocus. It's got a really good 1080p, and you can do 24 and 60 frames per second with that camera, whereas you know, the NX10's just limited to 720p at 30 frames per second. See, part of what I'm looking for when I make videos for this channel is finding cameras that are just an incredible bargain. And unfortunately, the price of the NX210 isn't a bargain. See, for what the NX10 is, I would need that price to be around $100 to $110 for me to actually recommend it, and it's just not. You know, and I guess that's the big takeaway. The only thing holding this camera back is the price. It's a fun little camera for what it is, but paying $200, you're starting to creep into that level where you can get like actually kind of modern, very capable cameras, you know? If you're only interested in photography and you don't mind spending $200, then yeah, the NX10 is great. You'll take great pictures with it. But I don't know, for me, knowing that I can get a really good hybrid camera in that price range, knowing that I can get something that takes great pictures and does good 1080p video, and also gives me the option to do kind of slow motion 1080p video, and all of that for a lower price, in that sense, it's kind of hard to recommend the NX10. It's still a great camera. I love it. I've used it for 10 years, but I don't know that I can recommend it at that $200 price point. Anyway, I think that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.